Hi, kids. All right. So in the last lecture, the United States became an empire. Okay. Well, what are we going to do with that? Okay. All right. So we have colonies now. What are we going to do with them? Okay. So let's talk about that. All right. So the first colony we're going to talk about is the Philippines. All right. The Philippines, first of all, we actually took full control of the Philippines after the end of the Spanish American War. Okay. So we end up paying $20 million to the Spanish as kind of a sorry for taking the Philippines from you, kind of deal. Okay. Um, the Filipinos were not real wild about having the United States replace the Spanish, okay, as their imperialist leader, and so the Filipinos engaged in a three-year conflict with the United States, trying to gain its independence. All right, eventually in 1901, the United States is able to put down the insurrection, and we were able to hold on to the Philippines as a colony, but of course at great cost to ourselves. Eventually, the Filipinos never wanted to be a colony of the United States. And so after World War II in 1945, the United States will grant the Philippines its independence. All right. And so the Philippines is no longer a colony of the United States. All right. Next, Puerto Rico. Okay. So here's a question. All right. So you live in Puerto Rico. Okay. Well, you're now an American colony. So what does that mean to you? All right, are you a citizen of Puerto Rico? Are you a citizen of the United States? Okay, what rights do you have under the Constitution? Okay, well, these are all questions that need to be answered, all right, by the United States government. Okay, and so a series of Supreme Court cases takes up those issues, okay, of citizenship and things like that. Okay, so in a group of cases known as the insular cases, and Delima versus Bidwell, all right, one of your terms, okay, is an example of one of these cases. All right, the court rules, okay, that acquired territories, so places like Puerto Rico or Guam, okay, are not necessarily entitled to constitutional rights, okay, and protections. That the United States Congress has to determine what applies and what doesn't apply. Okay, so just because you're a colony of the United States does not automatically guarantee you constitutional protection. All right, so we have to eventually kind of figure all of these things out for ourselves. Puerto Rico is initially, folks living in Puerto Rico are Puerto Rican citizens. Eventually, all right, they are granted United States citizenship, which is still the case today. All right. All right. Now, Cuba. Okay. In Cuba, all right, the United States had agreed, okay, in one of your other terms, the Teller Amendment, the United States had agreed that we would not colonize Cuba if we were able to defeat the Spanish in the war. And so we lived up to that promise. We did not colonize them. We did occupy Cuba for a number of years, all right, in an effort to help transition them from being a colony to being an independent nation. Okay. And at the end of that occupation in 1901, the United States helps the Cuban people write its own constitution. All right. And we insert in that constitution an amendment known as the Platt Amendment. Okay. And the Platt Amendment says three things. Okay. One, Cuba's not allowed to negotiate any treaties that we feel may compromise its independence. All right. Okay. We have the right to intervene militarily in Cuba at any time if we feel that that their rights or their freedoms are being infringed upon or if they're in danger in any way. And finally, we're allowed to lease, all right, the naval base at Guantanamo Bay, all right, in perpetuity, essentially, all right, and we still have Guantanamo Bay, all right, even though Cuba and the United States have not had great relations for decades since Castro's successful revolution in the late 1950s. The United States, okay, still maintains control of Guantanamo Bay. All right, well, why does the Platt Amendment matter? Okay, well, it allows the United States to essentially continually involve itself in Cuban affairs. And what it's going to do is it's going to inspire a lot of anti-American sentiment in Cuba because we're constantly meddling in their internal affairs. All right, think how you would react at your age to your parents involving themselves unnecessarily, okay, in your life, okay? And that's how the Cuban people felt. They felt that the United States was treating them as kind of their little brother or sister or their child, all right? And they resented that, okay? And that resentment grows and is one of the reasons why Castro's revolution is successful, because his revolution is innately anti-American. All right, that the United States is exploiting Cuba, all right, and a lot of Cuban people believe that. All right, so this is essentially the attitude that the United States has, okay, and a lot of the American people have towards the purposes of colonization and imperialism. Okay, it is our job, all right, along with other imperialist nations like the British, and you can see the British are portrayed right here. Okay, that we're trying to carry, all right, these uncivilized people from Cuba and other nations. We're trying to carry them up to civilization. All right, and that's of course is shown in light. Okay, and we're trying to climb over the pitfalls of barbarism and oppression and ignorance that we believe defines the lives of folks living in the nations that we've colonized. Okay, and that it is basically our job to teach these nations how to be civilized. All right. And so here in the front, you can see the Philippines and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Cuba, being kind of petulant children being talked down to by Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam saying, you have to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. Just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while, you will feel glad to be here as they are. All right. And who are the other groups? Okay. Women, Native Americans, African Americans. All right. All right. We argue or believed at the time that we had successfully civilized, okay, these other groups of people that live within the United States. All right. And so that is our attitude. All right. Okay. So Latin America, South America, okay, is not our only area of interest, okay, in the late 19th century. The United States is also interested in China. All right. In 1895, China gets into a war with Japan. Now, of course, you've seen a map. Okay, China's enormous. Okay, China is far larger and has far more people than Japan. Well, in this conflict, the Japanese win. Okay, the Japanese won the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and that stunned the world, and ended up leading to, all right, the major nations of Europe and Japan dividing China into spheres of influence. Okay, they didn't take over China, like sort of did. Okay, but they established spheres of influence and essentially dominate China and use China for their own benefit. Okay, well, the United States became concerned that any interest that we might have in China would be thwarted by this European imperialism and this Japanese imperialism. So in 1899, US Secretary of State John Hay proposes the open door policy. And what he says, okay, is that every nation in the world should recognize and respect China's right, okay, to trade, okay, or engage in relations with any nation that they wish. Okay, and of course, we're talking about ourselves, okay, and they asked, okay, and we asked, okay, that these nations that have essentially colonized China allow other nations to fairly compete there as well, and they agree. Okay, all right. Nobody really wants to go to war with the United States over China. All right, and I'm not saying that that would have necessarily happened, but why take the chance? All right. And so, the other major nations of the world, Britain, France, Russia, okay, agree, okay, that they can divide up the Chinese pie, okay, in one extra slice and include the United States. Okay. Well, not surprisingly, okay, many people in China, many Chinese people are opposed to all of this foreign involvement. First of all, foreign nations aren't particularly nice, okay, to the Chinese. They look down on them. They treat them poorly. It was common to see signs outside of embassies that would say "No dogs or Chinese allowed." Okay, so the Chinese people are not treated very well, okay, by the British, by the French, by the Germans, by the United States. Okay, well, in 1900 there was a rebellion against all of this foreign influence in China. Okay, and it's known as the Boxer Rebellion. And the reason it's called that is because the rebellion is led, okay, by a group with special martial arts training known as boxers. Okay, and the reason why they were called boxers was because they trained by using shadow boxing. All right, and so they could train individually. Okay, but that's why they became known as the boxers. Okay, well, the rebellion is eventually put down. Okay, they attacked foreign officials. Okay, and with the hopes of trying to remove foreign influence from China. Okay, well, that doesn't work. Okay, and again, those imperialist nations in China use their militaries to put down the rebellion. All right. Well, in the aftermath, many nations like England actually billed the Chinese government for the costs of putting the rebellion down. All right. And so negotiations ensue, and the Chinese government agrees to pay the costs to every nation, okay, for quelling the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, well, the United States, okay, uses the money that we receive from the Chinese government to establish an educational program for Chinese students to come to the United States. All right, so we use the money to try to build goodwill with the Chinese government, whereas many of the other nations just took the money. Okay, all right, so now, all right, the United States is involved in China. Okay, well, as our foreign policy is expanding, okay, and we're beginning to protect, okay, our interests around the world, that means that our actual foreign policies, things like the Monroe Doctrine, may need to be changed. All right, and we're going to talk about that, all right, in our next lecture.